Hi, my name is Brandy Fureman. I'm here today to talk to you about the intersection of NIH research and research that's funded by nonprofit or patient advocacy organizations. I'm qualified to do this because I have somewhat of an unusual background. I was trained as a neuroscientist coming from Penn State Hershey College of Medicine in neuroscience. And then I came to the NIH as a presidential management fellow. And I spent 2 years in that fellowship at the NIH at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, rotating through the different departments within the Institute, primarily those that fund the extramural research that goes out in the form of grants, contracts, cooperative agreements to universities across the country to do basic science, translational science, and clinical research. In the process of that experience, I found that I really loved being at the NIH and being part of the most cutting edge scientific ideas. And so I decided that I would continue my career at the NIH and joined the Institute as a full-time employee. And ultimately, I spent about 15 years at NINDS and ended up as a program director for epilepsy research. Now, program directors are very important people at the institutes across NIH because they can be your ally in trying to shape your research proposals so that they are competitive, they are compelling, and they're free of any of the red flags that most reviewers look out for. And so that was my job at NINDS. And after I'd been there for about 15 years and had some really amazing experiences in being able to help with strategic planning for the epilepsy field, help with major conferences and workshops that really tackled new issues for epilepsy, I decided that I was interested in getting a different perspective on how to move research forward. And so I decided to join the Epilepsy Foundation. This is one of the premier patient advocacy organizations for epilepsy. And I joined initially as the vice president for research. And in that position, I was able to see how advocacy groups, when they offer very targeted research opportunities, can help really shape a field, even with sometimes small amounts of money, but they can help shape the field because they find the gaps that are causing challenges for patients and their families. And they can offer targeted research opportunities to help fill those gaps. They do it in a number of different ways. And in the following presentation, I'll try to pull out a few ways in which patient advocacy groups can really come in and help to supplement what is available through NIH funding to really help move a field forward. I have to tell you that this has, for me, been an incredibly fulfilling career path. It's not one that I planned out in advance, but really just had the good fortune to take advantage of opportunities as they came up. And so I really encourage you to start to get to know the patient advocacy groups in the space of whatever area you're working in. If you're coming from a basic science background, there's almost always, some disease or disorder that is related to the pathway, the gene, the mechanism that you're studying. And having a relationship with some of the people who can be impacted by the work you do is something that can help focus your work. It can help motivate you through some really hard times. And I think ultimately ends in helping you to find real fulfillment in your career and your choices. So I'll use epilepsy as an example here, and forgive me if I overload you with epilepsy information, but it's been the field that I've been committed to for the last 20 years. But I also think it gives a really great example of how patient advocacy groups have found ways to help shape the direction of therapy development in their field. So I'll tell you a few disclosures. My salary is 100% funded by the Epilepsy Foundation of America, which is my nonprofit. And we receive revenue both from federal grants, pharmaceutical, biotech, and device industry sponsorships, private foundations, and individual philanthropy. Personally, I've received funding for research or public health projects from PCORI, the Centers for Disease Control, UCB, which is a biopharmaceutical company, and the National Association of Epilepsy Centers. And of course, I'm a neuroscientist, not a physician. So these comments are from the perspective of a scientist rather than a medical doctor. What I'd like to be able to share with you is that epilepsy is a group of conditions, sometimes we call them the epilepsies, that have very diverse kinds of treatment options. And there is a challenge in our community in that people with epilepsy can be treated by a wide range of professions, of clinicians. Some people are treated by their family physician, their pediatrician. And if their seizures are under control with, the first or the second medication, that's perfectly acceptable and fine. However, there are lots of people with epilepsy who have tried at least 2 medications or have been trying to get seizure control for at least a year, and they're not finding it. And for those people, they need to be seeking a higher level of epilepsy care. Often, higher levels of epilepsy care are where you're going to find newer medications, things that are just coming out of clinical trials, newly approved drugs, or even getting access to clinical trials. And so this issue of when should somebody move from the care of a generalist to a specialist is one that advocacy groups have really taken on as part of our mission to try to make sure that people are not staying in a general level of care, having seizures, having challenges, without moving on to epilepsy specialty care. So that's one way that advocacy groups have recognized that there's a gap, there's a need, and the voice that we bring to the community can help move people through that level of care trajectory. Many more investigational therapies are coming through the pipeline, especially for rare epilepsies. And here is, I think, the premier place where patient advocacy groups have made an incredible difference. We'll get into that in a little bit further. And one of the reasons that more investigational therapies are coming through is that our treatments are moving away from just controlling the seizures, just blocking sodium channels so that you don't have overexcitation in the nervous system, but really getting to the underlying reason for the overexcitation, the epilepsy. And so we're moving towards disease-modifying therapies, much in the same way that multiple sclerosis has been able to do in the last few years. And so there is really an explosion of new treatment development happening in the epilepsies right now, focused on understanding underlying mechanisms. What that means for people in the community is that it's now more important than ever to understand the underlying cause of your epilepsy. And that wasn't always true. The symptom management, the anti-seizure drugs that controlled just the seizures, it really didn't matter why you were having seizures. The seizure type itself was basically what determined which type of drug you should be taking. But that's no longer true. We're now developing treatments that will target very specific underlying causes. And so that means that more people need to be able to have molecular or etiologic specific diagnosis. That's another place where advocacy organizations have started to take the lead in saying genetic testing is important, it's useful, and it can determine treatment. And that we hope will start to change behavior in the clinician practice, especially when people are, have had their seizures for at least a year, or they've tried at least 2 drugs and they're not getting a response. It's really important to start to understand what the underlying cause of your epilepsy is so that the next treatment can be chosen so that it's more precise for you. As a basic scientist, the last key takeaway I'm going to make sure that I hit on this in this presentation is that getting to know the community can be key for you and your career. I mentioned earlier that there are lots of benefits of getting to know people who have a disease or a disorder that results from the mechanism that you study. There are also some career benefits to getting associated with advocacy groups, and I'll talk about those as well. So I mentioned there are lots of different treatments for epilepsy. Traditionally, there have been medicines. There are different types of epilepsy surgery. There are now multiple types of neuromodulation devices for people with epilepsy that can be implanted to help control seizures. There are medical diets like the ketogenic diet, Atkins diet, low glycemic index diet. There are self-management programs, even behavioral strategies to try to improve the level of seizure control and disease management. And finally, the newest group of therapies that are being developed are gene-targeted therapies. And again, when you have so much variation and diversity in the types of treatment options that can be available, it's really important that patient advocacy groups and I think the NIH does this really well as in addition, is to offer education to patients and families about these different treatment choices, about the questions that people should be asking their doctor as they go to make decisions about which of these treatments is right for them, and also to help drive the need for research to get better and more effective treatments in every one of these categories. So this is just a graph to show you the real explosion of different treatment options in epilepsy over time. And one of the things I want to point out is that you can see that this sort of inflection point near around carbamazepine, valproate, this period of time, right around the 1970s, was when the NIH decided to invest in an anticonvulsant screening program. Now, this meant that there was additional dollars directed towards research to develop new therapies to control seizures. And you can see the dramatic impact that has had its impact on the number of drugs that are available to treat epilepsy in that time frame. And this number keeps rising. But I wanted to make sure that people understood that there are places in therapy development where the NIH has taken special steps to make sure that there is new ideas coming through the pipeline, and it really has an impact. Now, I just wanted to share a little bit about how the change in moving from seizure control to very specific molecular diagnosis and why that's important. So the seizure types that you see on the top are the big categories of different types of seizures that people with epilepsy can have. You might have a seizure that has a focal onset, which only means that it begins in one place in the brain each time. Another type of seizure is called a generalized onset. Generalized seizures really affect the entire brain sort of all at once. And then there are seizure types for which we don't know, is it focal or generalized? We call that an unknown onset. And there can be a very large range of impact depending on the seizure types that you have. So there are folks who develop focal seizures really at any point in life, but especially for those who develop focal onset seizures as adults, often their cognition, their abilities outside of the seizure time is usually not as affected as if these seizures began in childhood, when your brain is also doing all of that massive development through childhood into adulthood. So there's a real range of impact of epilepsy. Some people are affected, certainly, but not to the degree that they can't work or the degree that they can't, sort of live a typical life. On the other hand, we have children who have started their seizures very early in life. It's had a dramatic impact on their cognition and on their development. Kids who are not verbal, kids who are in wheelchairs, kids who are, not able to fulfill all of the hopes and dreams that their families have for them. So it's a wide spectrum of impact. In the past, we've really only treated based on, are the seizures starting focally? Are they starting in a generalized way, or do we not know? And that has limited the kinds of effectiveness that those drugs can have. What's happening now is this shift over to etiology, understanding why the epilepsy is happening so that we can better target either medications, surgeries, devices, dietary therapies, or now some gene modifying therapies for that specific etiology. So this gets into a little bit more complicated types of epilepsy, and then leads to some epilepsy syndromes. And again, many of the epilepsy syndromes are the types of rare, devastating kinds of conditions that I mentioned earlier. Then there are also comorbidities, and comorbidities in epilepsy are a very broad topic, basically because we have things that can be impacted all the way from mental health and behavioral health kinds of issues, depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism. Very often autism and epilepsy can go hand in hand, all the way to, you know, effects on other systems, particularly when we're talking about a genetic epilepsy. And I want to bring out the fact that this is another place where the patient advocacy groups have really driven the research. You know, for many, many decades, epilepsy researchers were really focused on controlling the seizures. That was a lot of what was talked about in the epilepsy literature. But, you know, patient advocates came on the scene and they said, we definitely need seizure control. We would love seizure freedom. But if you give us seizure freedom without addressing some of these other comorbidities, you haven't gotten the job done. And so we talk in the epilepsy community now much, much more about comorbidities and really treating the whole collection of things that come along with epilepsy in a way that we never did before. So I really wanted to mention that because I think that that is definitely a contribution of patient advocacy organizations. Okay, so again, you know, we had this challenge of getting people to move to special epilepsy care and clinical trials when they have drug-resistant epilepsy. Okay, so I've talked about this before, the idea that we're moving towards disease-modifying therapies, and advocacy groups have had a huge impact on this movement towards disease-modifying therapies. As we have begun to understand more and more the genetic underpinning of epilepsy, and that comes from the basic research that's been done, most of it funded by the NIH. We've then seen the rise of patient advocacy groups around a particular gene or a particular set of genes within a pathway. And I have a slide at the end that will show you just a few of the rare epilepsy groups that have started to come to the forefront because they've had now a gene identified. And then more and more families get diagnosed with that same gene variant or pathogenic mutation, and they can find each other. They can come together and find community in a patient advocacy group. So it used to be that, you know, sort of basic research, drug discovery, preclinical work was really the domain of scientists. And there was not much involvement of patient advocacy groups at that stage of the research. I want to tell you, I have seen that change dramatically. Some of the rare epilepsy organizations that have emerged have been led by people who have very sophisticated understanding of science, of research, of you know, how to move from a basic science project into the next stage of a translational effort to get something out of that basic science and something that could be moved into the clinical arena. So I'll give you an example. There are some wonderful women who have developed a group called Wishes for Elliot. And Elliot is the son of one woman and the grandson of the other woman. It's a mom and daughter who have really done an amazing job moving the needle on their particular gene variant that has caused Elliot's devastating epilepsy condition. So his mutation is in a sodium channel. It's called SCN8A. And at the time when Elliot was diagnosed, they didn't know anyone else who had this same diagnosis. Well, they began a Facebook group. They started to reach out and find other families who were like them and managed to find another person who had a child with SCN8A who was also a researcher. They teamed up. Together, they reached out and found researchers who were working in that field in basic science and asked to meet with them, asked to talk with them, asked to learn from them, and very quickly recognized that one of the first things they could do was to help grow the field. So they formed an organization, and the very first research that they funded was a fellowship in order to get a new young person into the SCN 8A research community to start working on this problem that affected their son, their grandson, Elliot. And since then, this group has organized workshops. They have supported other research funding, and they've supported many other fellows, and really have started to grow an entire community around this particular area of basic science. They've also reached out to find places where there's overlap with their basic science. So they've partnered with groups who represent other sodium channel subunits, SCN2A, SCN1A, which causes one of the more common of the rare epilepsies called Dravet syndrome. So these groups have banded together and in some cases pooled their resources to have scientific meetings, conferences that can help accelerate the progress in the field, simply by bringing investigators together and also exposing investigators to the types of challenges that children who are living with these mutations face. There's really been, I think, a good positive impact of patient advocacy groups on the science underlying some of this therapy development, and also the rapidity with which it can move through the pipeline. One of the places that advocacy groups have really had an impact as well is in the clinical trial process. So, obviously, unless you have people willing to volunteer for clinical trials, you cannot make new therapies available. And so advocacy groups have recognized that we need to educate the patient community about how important clinical trials are and what they can and cannot do so that we get new therapies, the rigorous testing that they need before they go through the FDA review process. And so that's another place where patient advocacy groups have really made a difference in accelerating science. Now, I brought the epilepsy learning healthcare system onto this slide to show you that this is another place where even after drugs are approved, it's not necessarily a guarantee that those approved drugs are going to be used in the treatment of all the people who need them. And this is another challenge that we see in the epilepsy space, that a new drug will be approved, it will go out into the market, and there's sometimes not very much uptake from physicians or clinicians who were not involved in the original clinical trials. There's good reasons for that. And, in some cases, people would like to understand better the safety and the dosing and some other important considerations about using those drugs. But it does seem as though there's a real lag between the approval of a drug and the appropriate use of that drug in the entire patient population. And so one of the things that this epilepsy learning healthcare system, which I'm involved in through the Epilepsy Foundation, one of the things that we can do is start to track in a standardized way, what medications are people taking? What's their seizure frequency? How is their quality of life as a result of these medications, or changing medications, or surgery, or diet, any of the other types of therapies that are available, and really do some post-marketing kinds of observation so that we can start to develop real-world evidence about what is working well for people and what is not. So this is another place where, in this case, the Epilepsy Foundation, my nonprofit organization, supports the epilepsy learning healthcare system and brings together clinicians, researchers, patient advocates and their families, and community services providers to try to create a situation where the people are getting the best treatment for their specific condition, along with all the other supportive services that help improve quality of life. So I did mention that sometimes it takes a long time for a newly approved medication to get to the people who need it. And a great example of this is rescue therapy in epilepsy. So for many years, there was only one approach to having a rescue therapy for stopping an acute seizure, and that was rectal diazepam. Now, I want to say that the research that led to the availability of rectal diazepam was NIH funded. And for a long time, it was the only way that people had to stop seizures or clusters of seizures when they started. So it was a very important advance. But as you can imagine, rectal diazepam was not an acceptable therapy for everybody who has epilepsy. And so very recently, there have been some approvals of new rescue therapies for people that are, nasal sprays or other types of administration. And that's another place where patient advocacy groups can play a role in getting the word out about, number one, clinical trials that are testing these therapies, making sure that we have enough people enrolled in a rescue therapy trial so that it can have an adequate test. And also then, once these drugs are available and approved, that people and their physicians know that they're available. Something like a rescue therapy can stop someone from continuing to have a seizure that would then land them in the hospital. So it's an important addition to the treatment armamentarium, but not enough people know about them. And so again, this is a place where advocacy groups have jumped in and said, we can have a role in making sure that people are aware of this treatment option and how it can help improve their lives. Okay, this is just a list of approved medications that have come through recently or have really started to impact some of these very specific rare epilepsy disorders. And again, I'll mention, there is a Lennox-Gastaut Syndrome Foundation that has had a big role in helping to move these things forward. The Dravet Syndrome Foundation has a very robust research program that has contributed to the movement of some of these treatments. And tuberous sclerosis complex also has a wonderful patient advocacy group, the Tuberous Sclerosis Complex Alliance, and they have a decades-long research program that has really done a huge amount to address the multiple systems that are impacted by tuberous sclerosis complex, but also some disease-modifying therapies that theoretically could help prevent epilepsy before it begins. There's a clinical trial whose results we are all eagerly awaiting right now to really help us understand if treating somebody with TS prior to the onset of the obvious observable clinical seizure, treating at the time when we're just starting to see some abnormal EEG activity in the brain, can actually help prevent that person from progressing to the clinical epilepsy seizures. So that's a place where really the Tuberous Sclerosis Complex Alliance has helped to support animal model work, has helped to support disease assay work. They help to support the original identification of the genes involved in causing tuberous sclerosis complex, TSC1 and TSC2. So that's absolutely an example of an advocacy group investment in research that has really, really changed the outlook for people with this condition. Okay, I'll skip through this. And I wanted to just share a list of potentially treatable genetic or metabolic epilepsies that now, once you have this genetic information, really helps inform a treatment decision. And this has not been the case in epilepsy for many, many, many years. It's now starting to be the case that if you know that this is the affected gene, there are clear implications for treatment. And so what that means is we really need to start thinking about what is our genetic testing strategy for all people with epilepsy. There are probably people with epilepsy who have these gene variants that are undiagnosed. And that means that they may or may not be getting a treatment that is optimal for their particular genetic condition. Again, it's an awareness piece that advocacy groups are starting to take up. Again, a list of anti-seizure medicines that are currently in development, and many of these are not focused on the the channels that control excitability necessarily. They can be focused on the underlying protein or signaling pathway that leads to the overexcitability. Again, change to disease modifying therapy. So I'd like to finish up by sharing this slide with you of many of the rare epilepsy organizations that currently exist in the space and are having big impact on therapy development in the epilepsies. Nearly every one of these groups has a research component. They may employ a research program officer, someone who has scientific training and can help direct their research program, or they partner with professional advisory boards, medical advisory boards, scientific advisory boards, who help advise them on places where they should make their research investments. There is a lot of opportunity for someone with good scientific training to come to one of these rare or even more common advocacy groups to have an impact on how the field develops, how science gets connected to the patient communities that they're trying to serve. And so I encourage you to take a look outside of academia, if that's something that is of interest to you, because there is a world of opportunity for scientists to use their skills in a way that directly impacts patients and their families. It's a tremendously fulfilling approach to take with your career, and I highly recommend it. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone who'd like to think about pursuing that approach. Thank you for listening, and good luck.